November 2, 1944 started like any other mission for USAAF pilot Bruce Carr. Flying his trusty P-51 Mustang over the forests and rolling hills of Czechoslovakia, he was part of a larger escort mission, protecting Allied bombers as they targeted German industrial centers. The sky, usually filled with the roar of engines and the occasional tracer fire, became Carr's nightmare within minutes. Out of nowhere, a squadron of German fighters emerged from the clouds, the air filled with deadly tracer streaks as maneuvers became a desperate game of life and death. His Mustang was hit. Smoke began to trail from the fuselage, controls stiffening under his hands. He realized immediately that he wouldn't make it back to Allied territory. Forced down behind enemy lines, Carr faced a choice that no soldier ever wants to confront: surrender and hope for humane treatment, or take a chance that seemed almost suicidal. The winter was closing in. Snow dusted the ground, making every movement visible and freezing the streams of blood that might have resulted from a crash. He had no radio, no way to call for help, and his supplies were minimal. Even if he tried to escape on foot, the dense forests and German patrols made survival a gamble. Yet surrender didn't sit right. Something in him refused to give up, even in what seemed like an impossible situation. As he trudged through the snow and debris of the crash site, Carr assessed his options. He knew the Germans would comb the area quickly, looking for any downed pilots. Survival depended on his speed, stealth, and ingenuity. Every step he took carried the risk of being discovered, every breath a reminder that the enemy was close. His training as a fighter pilot had taught him strategy in the air, but nothing could have prepared him for this cold, silent battlefield. He became a shadow moving through the winter woods, always alert to the sounds of boots on the frozen earth, the low hum of enemy vehicles, and the distant gunfire from other skirmishes. By nightfall, the situation grew more dire. Darkness was both a blessing and a curse. It offered concealment, but it also brought disorientation and the ever-present danger of frostbite. Carr found a small hollow in the trees to rest, his mind racing. How could he survive until morning? How could he escape a country brimming with enemy forces? He knew the only way forward was to think like a pilot and like a predator, anticipating every move of his hunters. In those moments, the idea of surrender slowly faded. Something else began to take shape, a plan that was as bold as it was unthinkable. Carr had noticed the Luftwaffe airfield during reconnaissance earlier that day, and the thought of it planted a seed in his mind. He had seen German aircraft lined up, engines cold, pilots gone for the night. Could it be possible to use one of those very planes to fly himself out? At first, the thought seemed insane. How could he operate an enemy fighter without instructions, without knowing the controls, without anyone to guide him? Yet desperation breeds courage, and in Carr's case, it ignited something far more dangerous than fear: determination. He realized that staying hidden in the woods would only delay the inevitable. To survive, he needed to act, and he needed to act fast. The night stretched on. Every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind set his nerves on edge. Yet as he planned each careful step, he began visualizing the impossible. He imagined approaching the airfield undetected, climbing into a Focke-Wulf Fw and somehow taking it into the sky. Each scenario played in his mind with vivid clarity, a rehearsal for an escape that no training manual had ever covered. And by the time the first stars twinkled in the Czechoslovakian sky, Bruce Carr wasn't just a downed pilot behind enemy lines. He was a man with a plan, a man ready to turn the tables in a situation that had seemed hopeless.
The night after his crash, Bruce Carr moved cautiously through the dense Czechoslovakian forest. Each step was deliberate, careful not to snap twigs or disturb the snow, knowing the Germans could be anywhere. The cold was biting, seeping through every layer of his clothing, and the wind whispered through the trees like a warning. Hunger gnawed at him, but there was no time to eat. Every moment he lingered increased the chance of discovery. The forest, normally a refuge, felt like a labyrinth of danger, with shadows hiding both predators and patrols. Carr had to rely on instinct, the same instincts that had guided him through countless dogfights. He used the terrain to his advantage, moving through hollows and behind fallen logs to stay unseen. At times he stopped entirely, pressing his back against trees, listening for the faintest sound of movement. The snow muffled some of his footsteps, but he could hear the distant shuffle of German patrols, their boots crunching over frozen ground. Each encounter, even from afar, reminded him how close death really was. During the day, he concealed himself in a small natural hollow, using branches and snow to camouflage his presence. He scavenged what he could, a handful of dried rations from his crash pack, a piece of chocolate, anything to keep his strength up. Water was scarce, and the cold made every sip feel like fire on his lips. But survival demanded more than just sustenance, it required planning. Every movement had to be calculated, every decision carried life or death consequences. As hours stretched into days, Carr's mind turned over one impossible thought again and again: the enemy's airfield. He had observed it from a distance, noting the pattern of guards, the locations of planes, and the timing of patrols. The longer he stayed hidden, the more he understood that surrender was not an option. The idea of taking a German fighter, once an idle fantasy, began to feel like the only path to survival. He studied the terrain in his mind, mapping out paths that would avoid the main patrols, imagining each step of his approach to the aircraft. Every shadow became a possible threat, every noise a signal to freeze or change direction. The psychological toll was immense. Isolation, fear, and exhaustion pushed him to the edge, but Carr's resolve strengthened. Each night, as he lay shivering and alone, he rehearsed the plan in his head. He imagined the feel of the cockpit, the sound of the engine, the thrill and terror of taking off in an aircraft designed for the enemy. He ran every scenario, including failure, over and over, until it became a mental map he could follow blindly. He visualized the controls, the gauges, and the weight of the machine, imagining himself mastering it without guidance. Despite the danger, Carr noticed small signs of opportunity: a guard shift changing just as he expected, a gap in the perimeter fencing, a plane left unguarded for the precious few minutes. These details, invisible to most, were his lifeline. He learned to move silently, to observe without being seen, to rely entirely on his instincts as a pilot and a man fighting for survival. The forest, once an overwhelming threat, had become his training ground, a place to prepare for the audacious act that could save his life. He even started tracking the guards' routines meticulously, noting patterns in their movements and timing, which could later become critical for his plan. By the third night behind enemy lines, Carr's desperation had transformed into determination. Hunger, cold, and fatigue were constants, but they sharpened his focus. He no longer thought of surrender. He thought only of the plan: approach the airfield, climb into the Focke-Wulf Fw and fly. Every nerve in his body was tuned to that goal. The forest had been his ally, the cold a reminder of his vulnerability, and the constant presence of enemy patrols a teacher of caution and patience. Every moment spent hiding had strengthened his resolve, each step forward in the snow making him mentally ready for the impossible task that lay ahead.
As the nights passed, Bruce Carr's mind sharpened with one impossible idea. He would steal a German fighter and fly himself out of enemy territory. At first, it seemed insane. The Focke-Wulf Fw was nothing like his P-51 Mustang. Its controls were unfamiliar, its cockpit cramped, and there were no manuals, no allies, no instructions. Yet the more he thought about surrender, the more impossible it seemed. Surrender would mean capture, interrogation, and possibly death. If he acted, however, he could reclaim control of his fate entirely. Carr had been observing the Luftwaffe airfield for days, memorizing the guards' shifts, noting which planes were left unguarded, and timing the patrol routes with military precision. Every observation became a puzzle piece in his mental map. The Fw-190 he targeted sat at the far end of the airfield, under minimal guard, engines cold for the night. Carr imagined slipping through the shadows, the crunch of snow muffled by careful steps, and reaching the aircraft without being seen. His plan had to account for every variable: the guards, the fences, the dogs, and even the possible approach of Allied aircraft. Every day he rehearsed the sequence in his mind. He imagined opening the canopy, climbing into the cockpit, and discovering the controls one by trial and error. He visualized turning the key, engaging the engine, feeling the vibrations beneath him, and slowly taxiing out onto the field. Each imagined failure was dissected and corrected in his thoughts, preparing him for the unexpected. In his mind, he ran the scenario repeatedly until it felt almost real, almost achievable. Carr knew timing was critical. One wrong move and the entire plan would collapse. He observed the soldiers' routines meticulously: when they walked too close, when they looked away, when the night shadows would mask his movements. He even noted the lights on the airfield and how long it took for guards to react to any movement. These small details, invisible to most, were essential for his survival and success. Every step had to be synchronized with the rhythm of the enemy's vigilance. At times, fear threatened to overwhelm him. The thought of being caught, shot, or failing in front of the enemy was terrifying, yet he converted that fear into precision. The risk became a tool rather than a burden. His entire training as a fighter pilot, situational awareness, split-second decision-making, understanding mechanics, now applied to something far more audacious than any aerial dogfight. The forest and the airfield were now a single battlefield, and Carr had to master both. By the end of the third night, Bruce Carr had mentally rehearsed every aspect of the plan so many times that it became second nature. He could see himself moving through the shadows, reaching the Fw-190, turning the engine over, and taxiing onto the runway, all without hesitation. Each imagined takeoff, every imagined twist of the controls, strengthened his confidence. Desperation had transformed into daring, and the impossible began to feel like a tangible goal. For the first time since he had been shot down, Carr believed he could escape, not as a hidden fugitive, but as a man who could take the fight to the very enemy he had been running from.
The night had finally come. Bruce Carr approached the Luftwaffe airfield, moving through the shadows with every nerve on high alert. Snow crunched softly beneath his boots, and the faint glow of the moon illuminated the edges of hangars and parked planes. He could hear distant voices, the occasional bark of a guard dog, and the low hum of engines cooling from the day's missions. One wrong move, one snap of a twig, and the entire plan would collapse. He reached the far end of the field, where the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 he had been studying for days sat silently. Its dark fuselage blended into the night, but Carr could see the gleam of the canopy and the shape of the propeller. The guards were distant, momentarily distracted, giving him a small window to act. With trembling hands, he opened the canopy, careful not to make a sound. The cockpit was cramped and foreign, every lever and gauge unfamiliar, but he had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind. Sitting inside, he had to figure out the controls purely by trial and error. He experimented cautiously, moving levers and pressing pedals, listening to the faint clicks and whirs. Slowly, methodically, the engine roared to life, vibrating beneath him. The sound echoed across the field, and Carr's heart pounded as if it might give him away. He held his breath, waiting for any sign of detection, but the guards remained unaware. He tested the throttle gently, feeling the aircraft respond. The FW-190, once a machine of the enemy, now became his vehicle of survival. Taxiing across the frozen tarmac, he kept low, hugging the shadows to avoid searchlights. Every step forward was tense. He knew the Germans could spot him at any moment, and Allied planes overhead could mistake him for the enemy. Carr's mind raced as he navigated the unfamiliar aircraft, recalling every detail of its design he had studied from a distance. The FW-190 responded to his touch as if he had flown it for years, and yet every maneuver carried the risk of catastrophe. Finally, he reached the edge of the field, lined with snowbanks and obstacles. Carr adjusted the throttle, feeling the plane surge forward. The wheels left the ground, and for a moment the world seemed to hang still. Darkness and winter forests stretched beneath him, but he was free. Flying low, he stayed under radar and enemy observation, weaving between hills and treetops. Every second in the air was a test of skill, courage, and instinct. Tracers from German flak bursts exploded in the distance, and Allied anti-aircraft fire occasionally whipped past, a reminder that danger existed on all sides. Hours seemed to stretch as he navigated enemy territory. Carr relied on his instincts, the same skills that had kept him alive in dogfights. He adjusted his altitude, listened for the sounds of pursuit, and kept the aircraft steady despite exhaustion and fear. The thrill of flying an enemy fighter mixed with the terror of being shot down again, creating a tension that was almost unbearable. Each passing minute was a small victory, each mile closer to Allied territory, a testament to his daring and ingenuity. By the time he crossed the front lines, Bruce Carr had become more than just a pilot. He was a man who had turned desperation into action. The FW-190, a symbol of the enemy's power, now carried him to freedom. Every nerve, every muscle, every decision had brought him this far, and as the snow-covered landscape gave way to the faint lights of Allied territory, Bruce Carr realized that what he had achieved that night was more than survival. It was an act of courage, ingenuity, and unyielding determination, a story that would endure long after the war ended.
After hours of tense flight, Bruce Carr finally saw the first signs of Allied territory below. The snow-covered hills and scattered villages glimmered faintly under the pale winter sun, a stark contrast to the dark forests he had navigated for days. Every mile closer to safety was a mixture of relief and renewed tension. He still had to land, still had to survive the final moments of a mission unlike any other. The FW-190 beneath him was a powerful machine, but unfamiliar, and one wrong move could destroy everything he had risked. Carr carefully adjusted his approach, keeping low to avoid both German patrols and any friendly fire from Allied forces who might mistake him for the enemy. His hands were steady, though fatigue weighed heavily on him. He had been awake for days, moving constantly, surviving in freezing conditions, and now flying a fighter built for his adversaries. Every decision, from throttle adjustments to wing angle, carried the weight of life or death. Yet he trusted his instincts, honed from countless hours in the cockpit, to guide him through the final stretch. As he neared the designated Allied airfield, relief and tension mingled. He had to communicate, but without a radio, he relied on familiar visual cues and standard landing procedures. The FW-190 responded with a grace that belied its reputation, and Carr maneuvered skillfully, weaving past obstacles and lining up for a proper approach. Each second felt suspended in time. The danger was not over.
Allied pilots on the ground and in the air were alert, and any mistake could trigger a deadly misunderstanding. Finally, the wheels touched down. Snow sprayed gently from the runway, and the powerful engine roared as Carr applied brakes, slowing the aircraft with precision. Ground crews and fellow pilots rushed forward, eyes wide with disbelief. A downed P-51 pilot, shot behind enemy lines, had returned, flying a German fighter he had stolen himself. Carr climbed out of the cockpit, exhausted, exhilarated, and filled with a sense of accomplishment that few could ever understand. The impossible had become reality. News of Carr's escape spread quickly among his squadron and the wider Allied forces. It was not just a story of survival, it was a tale of ingenuity, courage, and audacity. Military historians later marveled at the precision, nerves, and bravery required for such an escape. Few had ever attempted anything similar, and even fewer had succeeded. Bruce Carr's daring act had not only saved his life, but had turned a moment of defeat into one of the most legendary escapes of World War II. As he recounted the experience in later interviews, Carr always emphasized the combination of observation, patience, and daring. Every detail mattered: the patrols, the terrain, the timing, the mechanics of the enemy aircraft. He had relied on his training, but also on his courage and quick thinking, proving that even in the most desperate situations, bold action could triumph. His flight back from behind enemy lines became a symbol of resilience, reminding everyone that in war, ingenuity and determination could turn the tide for those brave enough to seize the moment. By the time he rejoined his unit, Bruce Carr had not only survived, he had created a story that would be remembered for generations. The stolen Fw-190, the daring flight through enemy territory, and the careful landing on Allied soil became more than an escape. They became a testament to the skill, bravery, and unbreakable spirit of a fighter pilot who refused to surrender. Fellow pilots were inspired, and Carr's story quickly became legendary within the USAAF, a tale that would be told to new recruits as an example of ingenuity, courage, and the unyielding human spirit in the face of impossible odds. Even decades later, historians and aviation enthusiasts would recount that night, marveling at how a single man, armed with only his wits and his determination, turned what seemed like certain death into a feat of extraordinary skill and bravery.